Imagine a world without Google. No, seriously, a world without Google. A world where you couldn't do detailed reconnaissance on your blind date for tomorrow night. A world where you couldn't find out with the click of a mouse the GDP of Kazakhstan. A world where if you're not feeling well, you can't just sit down at your computer and figure out whether to just pop a couple aspirin or whether you need to call 911. It's amazing, right? Just 10 years ago, there was no Google. And 5 years before that, there was no way at all to search the internet. And that posed a big problem. Because really, what use was the World Wide Web if you couldn't navigate it and get where you wanted to go? The companies that took a stab at search included some of the most iconic names in the history of the net, like Yahoo and Excite. But even though the guys who started those outfits were some of the brightest young things in the annals of American business, again, they found themselves unable to crack the code. Then a pair of super brainy, super nerdy 20-somethings solved the search problem. I'm going to tell you how they did it, and how they became multi-billionaires in the process. In short, the world was hungry for a radically better way of searching the web. Sure enough, it came from the exact same institution that had already produced Yahoo and Excite, Stanford. Once again, the name of the company was unrepentantly goofy. Google, a twist on the word Google, a mathematical term for 10 to the 100th power. And once again, the founders were a pair of barely socialized young geeks, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. The guys first met in the spring of 1996 on a guided tour of San Francisco for prospective graduate students at Stanford. Leading the tour was Sergey, a good-looking Russian-American kid with a bit of an attitude. It was nice guy Larry who had the genius insight that turned search into something magical and launched Google. Given the far-reaching consequences of this insight, social, cultural, and certainly financial, you might think that it's incredibly complex. But in fact, in its basic form, it's pretty simple. His insight started with the notion that the web was running a continual popularity contest on its own content, and that the number of times a given web page was linked to by other sites might be a measure of how useful or how relevant it was. When Larry and Sergey launched Google onto the Stanford website, everyone who saw it realized it was something special. Here was a search engine that cared about search again. From their grad student office on the Stanford campus, shown here in this never-before-seen footage, Page and Brin struggled to manage the runaway popularity of their wondrous innovation.
There was so much traffic to Google that it nearly brought the entire Stanford University internet to its knees. And so the university administration said, you must move off campus.
Stanford had outlived its usefulness to Larry and Sergey. It was time for them to head off campus and into Silicon Valley proper, to look for some cash, to turn their bright idea into an honest-to-goodness company. In doing so, they'd be joining thousands of would-be entrepreneurs seeking fame and fortune in the dot-com era Silicon Valley, which meant that the odds were clearly stacked against them.
Larry and Sergey happened on a little site that was growing quite nicely with sponsored listings called Overture. And Larry in particular, I think, felt that this offered a roadmap for what Google, for a business that Google might be able to get into. The Google boys arranged to meet Bill Gross, and then to meet him again and again. Much of business history is determined by such meetings between aspiring titans meeting behind closed doors.
Of course, at noon, the trading turned on, and the first trade was at $100, $15 higher than the previous day's price, and it never went below that.
In the end, despite all the Sturm und Drang, the Google IPO was a success by the measure that matters most. Anyone who bought shares that day and is still lucky or smart enough to have them has made a whopping bundle. 3 years after the offering, Google was valued more highly than FedEx, McDonald's, Coke, Intel, IBM, or Walmart. Shares that traded at $100 had soared to nearly $700. Meanwhile, Brin and Page are ranked among the top 30 richest people in the world. Google has poured its gargantuan profits into countless experiments and projects, sticking its fingers into every pie within its reach. There's Google Library, Google Books, Google Maps, and Google Earth. There's Gmail, Google Calendar, Google Spreadsheets, and Google Docs. The company bought the startup Blogger for personal web publishing. It bought the startup Picasa for online photo sharing, and of course, YouTube for online video sharing.